In this video, let's unravel what a moral dilemma actually is, and then some examples to illustrate the situations in which an individual encounters such dilemmas. And then let's explore the differences between moral intuition and moral reasoning and some examples to illustrate these concepts better. First concept is moral dilemma, and the second concept is moral intuition, and third is moral reasoning and the differences between moral intuition and reasoning. And then we will also discuss how moral intuition and moral reasoning influence each other, and why is it crucial to harmonize and balance both these approaches, because neither of these approaches is superior on its own, because both these approaches have their own strengths and weaknesses. Let's have a look at the strengths and weaknesses of both the approaches and the need to harmonize both these things, moral intuition and reasoning. Now let's come to our first question. What is moral dilemma? Moral dilemma is a situation where a person, here the person can be referred to as moral agent, because he is forced to choose between two conflicting choices. So here there are two conflicting choices to the person, and the moral agent can be a person or can be a government or legislature, or it can be an organization or Supreme Court, anything. So the moral agent has to choose between two or more conflicting choices. Now, why is it called a dilemma? Because there is no perfect solution for the conflict that is morally acceptable. So there is no perfect solution. But why is it difficult to make such decisions? That's because such decisions force us to weigh one choice over the other. So we need to weigh one choice over the other, though both choices have their equal and both choices have equal weightage and have their own set of immoral consequences. That means for any choice or action that's taken up, there are some moral principles that have to be compromised at any cost. For example, if the choice 1 is picked up, there are some moral principles that have to be compromised for not choosing option 2. Say if option 2 is chosen, then some moral principles are compromised because option 1 is not chosen. So picking up any one choice has moral consequences and impact the stakeholders in that particular context. So for examples, I'll quote some examples. The first is during the pandemic, there were not as many beds as required. Some felt that it's better to treat senior citizens first as they are more vulnerable, while some felt it's better to treat young people. So there is a dilemma between whether to treat young people or to treat old people. Old people are more vulnerable and young people are more productive. So whom to choose? There are not enough beds. So here the conflict arises between principle of equality, which says every life is equal, and the second principle is maximizing benefit by saving young, because young people are more productive and have so much of life later. So the conflict is between the principle of equality and the principle of maximizing benefit. So let's take another example. This is a debate that has been continuing since long. So when we talk about the abortion thing, it is the woman's right whether to have a child or not. So it is a right to her bodily autonomy, and then that right comes into conflict with the right to life of fetus. So fetus right to life, the conflict between right to life of fetus and the bodily autonomy of the woman. So this is another example for moral dilemma. And there is this trolley, most common trolley example, where there is a track and there is a trolley that is coming towards these persons, and you are near a lever and you can switch the lever, so that if you switch the lever, the trolley, instead of going into this direction, it diverts and goes to this direction. So now you are left with two options. You should either not involve into this by not pulling the lever, or you can pull the lever in order to save 5 lives. So you are compromising life of one person for the sake of 5 other people. So here your intuition may suggest you to pull the lever in order to maximize the benefit. So this is a kind of greatest good for greatest number of people, which is set by utilitarianism. Whereas deontology is where you are not involved in this action. You are not actively involving to cause harm. So this is what deontology means. Instead of actively causing harm by pulling the lever, you better not involve of what is happening before you. So here the moral action that you take up is given more weightage than active harm. So the moral character of the person is greater than the outcome that this action is going to generate. So here arises a conflict between utilitarianism and then the deontology. These are the two ethical principles, and between these two conflicting choices, you have to make your decision. You are the moral agent here. So this is considered as a dilemma because there are two conflicting choices. Then there is no perfect solution, because whatever choice you pick up, whether to leave the lever as it is or whether you will pull the lever, at least one life will die. So the moral consequences, so the impact is the death of the life, and you're not able to save the life irrespective of your choice. So this is a moral dilemma. Now let's try to understand the differences between moral intuition and moral reasoning. But before that, I want you to imagine yourself as an officer. So you are an officer now, and you were offered a bribe, and that is to expedite the processing of a file. Now, the moment I uttered this sentence, some of you might have felt a sense of ethical concern about the acceptance of the bribe. So, there are a section of people, say this section of people are considered A. You have felt a sense of ethical concern about the acceptance of bribe because you have certain morals that were ingrained in you. There were some morals that were ingrained in you during your brought up through your teachers, through your parents, through your friends, or through social media. So, through various means, you have learned some morals. So you reject the bribe in the imaginary situation that I created. That is because the society has taught you what is morally right and what is morally wrong. So what is wrong, what is right was taught to you by the society. And that is why your gut level reaction to reject the bribe, which was instantaneous. It was instantaneous, fast response. It was an emotional response that you got. That is based on your conscience and your past life experience. So these two made you to choose the choice, which is rejecting the bribe. So this is your moral intuition. So your moral intuition came into play. It's a gut level response that told you to reject the bribe because you have learned such values from the society. Society has taught you the values. What is right, what is wrong. Now let's see, while people thought like this, there are some other set of people. So these people have gone a step further and considered the legal implications that might come up and the loss of public trust. And so they decided to reject the bribe. So fearing the legal complications that might come up, people in the B section of the audience decided to reject the bribe. So in this case, people analyzed the situation. They made logical arguments. So logic came into play. Then you analyzed. Then you arrived at a decision, that is to reject the bribe. So this is an emotional response, the immediate response that you got. Whereas the B section of people, they went with logic and reasoning to arrive at this conclusion. They analyzed the consequences that might come up. There are also set C. So people in this set C must have done both things. That is, they thought both emotionally and also rationally. So emotional and rational, and then decided to reject the bribe. So the morals came into play. That is the emotional response. At the same time, the logic came into play. So that is the rational and reasoning part. This is considered as a well thought out decision because here you ensure the harmony between your intuition as well as your reasoning. So this is considered as a well thought out decision. Someone else must have felt, I'll take the bribe if it matches my expectation, and if it is that high, then I'll take the bribe. If that is the case, and that is the moral intuition that he has. So these set of people have a moral intuition which says to take the bribe. So here there is a temptation. That is the intuition. Also, he thought about the risk and concluded that it is worth the risk. The amount of money that is given in the form of bribe is worth the risk. So that is the reasoning part. So we discussed A section, B section, C and D. So we have seen there is emotional response, there is reasoning response, and C set of people, there is a combination of intuition and reasoning. That is emotional and rational decision, and that is a well thought out decision. Here we are not judging about what is right and what is wrong, or we are not classifying an act as unjust or just. Here we are looking at the responses and reactions of a human to a circumstances or to a dilemma based on his past experiences. Based on his past experiences, based on the conscience, based on the morals, based on the logic, and based on the analysis. Based on all these things, how a human is responding to a circumstance is what we looked at in this example. Now let's revise the differences of moral intuition and moral reasoning by describing them through some words. Coming to the moral intuition, you come across a situation, and then there is a spontaneous emotional response from you. It's very instantaneous, it's very immediate, it's very quick response that you are generating. You can parallelly remember the bribe example that we just saw. So now his personal values, his societal norms, the norms that he learned from the society, or the norms that the society is following, or the conscience. So all these things come into him, and then those lead to the emotional response that he has given. And then he makes a decision based on that emotional response. That is, in the example that we saw, he immediately rejected the bribe. The A set of people immediately rejected the bribe, that is the moral intuition. Or taking the bribe, immediately taking the bribe because of the temptation. So that is also moral intuition. Now coming to moral reasoning. First, the conflict is identified. Here the officer sees a conflict between integrity, professional ethics and integrity, versus his personal gain. So he first identifies the conflict. Then he gathers information. What if I take the bribe? What if I don't take the bribe? He gathers information from the past experiences, or from the past stories that he has heard. Now he identifies the stakeholders. Now who are all the stakeholders? The officer is a stakeholder. Then the government is the stakeholder. Then the public is stakeholder. So the public trust is at stake when he decides to take a bribe. So he considers moral principles. What are the moral principles involved? Then he thinks of the possible actions and analyze the consequences. So if I take the bribe, what are the possible consequences? If he takes the bribe, there is loss of public trust, and then that leads to some legal complications. So those are the consequences if he accepts the bribe. If he doesn't accept the bribe, what are the consequences? He analyzes all these things with his logic by applying some ethical theories. Then he justifies this decision, and then he learns from the decision. Based on the outcome of the decision, he learns what is to be done, what choice should he pick up, and then he applies the same to the other conflict that he has to face through moral reasoning. Now let's study this in more detail. As you already saw, moral intuition is immediate response, it's an instantaneous response, it is emotions driven, it's unconscious decision, whereas moral reasoning is conscious decision. Brain is applied here, so it is mind driven. As brain is applied, it's a conscious decision, and it's a rational decision because information is gathered and then the decision is taken. Moral intuition relies on moral values. It's a gut level response, whereas moral reasoning relies on logical arguments. What are the pros of this decision? What are the cons of this decision? What consequences should I face? I means the moral agent. All these things are analyzed and then the decision is made. Moral intuition is fast, it's very quick. And in moral reasoning, it is slow because a lot of analysis is done in the background. And moral intuition is based on empathy, kindness, and compassion. Whereas the moral reasoning is impartial, it is fair, it's objective, it's practical way of being. Now, the other difference is moral intuition is unconditional self-response. In the example that we just took now, when a person is suffering, without any interference of your ego, you respond. You respond as one life helping the other life. Whereas in the moral reasoning, you think in a structured, systematic, and sustainable manner. Okay. And the other difference is when you accumulate some information, when you get exposed to new experiences, you might change your emotional response. For the same situation, you might behave cranky at one point, whereas you might change your perception towards the same situation and behave differently. You might give a different emotional response. Whereas in moral reasoning, generally your decisions are consistent because the logic is always the same. So you are more consistent in your decisions. Then moral intuition is more biased and has some limited beliefs because there is this identification. You are identified with your tendencies, with your morals, with your values. So it is more biased decision making by limited beliefs. Whereas in moral reasoning, you have a broad range of factors that you consider. You see the cause, you see the effect, you see the consequence, then you think of a solution. So it is more systematic because you are considering a broad range of factors here. Now let's see why is harmony required between moral intuition and moral reasoning. First, we need to understand that moral intuition and moral reasoning, none of these is superior over other. Because if you make decisions based on your moral intuition, there are some strengths or there are some advantages. One is that your decision is quick, so you act promptly. Whereas the weakness is you ignore the law. Here you ignore the long-term consequences that might arise because you made a decision based on your intuition without going with the logic. At the same time, if you make decisions based on the reasoning, moral reasoning, then definitely your decision is more systematic, sustainable, and practical. But there is also a disadvantage for this because you are ignoring the emotional aspect here, and the decision is slow because it needs a lot of thinking. So, but for your decision to be a well thought out decision, for your decision to be a well rounded decision, you need to incorporate both intuition and reasoning, and then you need to take the action. So, your moral judgment, when it is mix of intuition and reasoning, is nothing but you take into account the emotional aspects and also the rational aspects, and then you're taking the analytical aspects, and your decision is a well thought out decision, and then you're consistent in your decisions because you're putting logic into it, so that you will build trust because your decision is considering broad range of factors, and then your decision will be fair and just. Okay, then second is that there are no universal conclusions. There's nothing right, there's nothing wrong. Everything is based on what society has taught you. It is based on the ethical framework that we developed and the conscience that a person has. Now let's look at 3 other examples and explore how each stakeholder demonstrated their intuition and reasoning in each of these 3 scenarios. So the first scenario is there are 2 stakeholders, a doctor and a terminally ill patient. And this terminally ill patient's intuition is driven by her pain and suffering. And she doesn't want a life without dignity, and she feels that there is only one compassionate choice that she's left with, because her emotional state led her to believe that euthanasia is a merciful relief and she can end her life so that she can avoid the pain and suffering that she's having now. So this is the intuition that she has. What does her reasoning say? Her reasoning says that she has the right to decide about her life, and she has the right to control the treatment decisions. So her final ethical decision she takes up is to choose euthanasia than to suffer. Now, the other stakeholder is the doctor. So on the other hand, doctor's intuition suggests to not to administer euthanasia to her because it is unnatural termination of natural death. So that is what the intuition of doctor says. It is his duty to preserve life, to ensure long life to his patient. He want his patient to live as long as possible. That's what his professional ethics say. So then his moral reasoning comes into play, where he understands that the administration of euthanasia leads to some legal and judicial implications also. So there is a conflict whether to act as per the wishes of the patient or to actively cause harm. So whether to administer euthanasia to her as per patient wishes or to follow his medical ethics. On one hand, he doesn't want to interfere into the natural life processes, and he's also aware of the complications, legal and judicial complications that might come up later if he administers euthanasia. So finally, he checks the legality of euthanasia in India, then he consults other professionals, then he takes into account the medical ethics, then he considers the patient's autonomy. It is her right to decide, and then he arrives at a decision by considering both the intuition and reasoning, so that the decision will be a well thought out decision. Now let's come to another scenario. There is this stranger X, and you see that he is suffering from something. See, he is in distress. So there are 2 persons, A and B. The immediate response that A got, what his intuition said to him is go and help that person who is in need, because his past experiences or the moral values that he learned say that help people who are in need. And this drives him to reason. Then he analyzes the things because he knows that when someone in distress is helped, then that leads to positive outcomes. That is what he saw in his past. So this reinforces his instinct to help. So he goes near to that stranger X without thinking about, without knowing about the detailed information about the stranger. He goes and offers him the help. Whereas there is person B. What his intuition says is it is better to stay away from strangers, because he has seen some instances in his past where talking to a stranger led to some negative outcomes. So now for him there is a mix of compassion towards the stranger X as well as there is some hesitation, because he do not know the complete information about X. So approaching X without understanding the full context of X could be risky, is what B's intuition says. So he thinks instead of going towards X, he'll stay away from X and then call ambulance services from distance. So this is what his reasoning told him. So the help is required. He doesn't want to go to X. So he stays at a distance and calls ambulance services so that the positive outcome can be generated. So this is how A and B behave differently, because their intuitions were different and their intuitions drove their reasoning, and that led to take them their final ethical decisions. They evaluated the information, they evaluated the ethical principles, they evaluated the help that is needed by X, they evaluated the consequences, and then finally arrived at an ethical decision. Now let's take the third example. There is a civil servant and there is a flood in a coastal district. So the immediate emotional response of the civil servant is to provide medical aid and then the shelter. So this is the immediate response that the civil servant thought of. And then he sees this as the most compassionate choice. Now this intuition drives him to think in a structured manner where he reasons that a criteria needs to be laid to allocate funds, because the severity of damage may differ, and based on the areas that are more vulnerable, based on the areas that are more severely damaged, based on the vulnerability of population, a criteria needs to be laid instead of randomly allocating funds. So he understands that there is a need for transparent process to execute such things. So he made a balance between his heart and brain. So there is a balance between heart and brain. There is a balance between emotion and rational thinking. And this is how his decision became a well-rounded decision. So this marks the end to this video. So what we discussed what is moral dilemma, and then we saw some examples for moral dilemmas, and then we discussed what is moral intuition and moral reasoning, and for some examples to each of them. And then we saw how to harmonize both intuition and reasoning, because that is essential for a decision to be well-rounded. And we saw that none of these, intuition or reasoning, is superior over other. Both have their own set of strengths and weaknesses.